This is going to be for data. It's on apply. It's to see whether or not others actually ask the questions they were in to write the responses. Well, some of that. Some of that. At least it's up to us. I guess, but I don't know. Let them have it.
Just look a bit older. Yeah, I know. I'm gonna head out at like 11 or so. I can't be here forever. I don't even know what questions they would ask. I'm curious what questions.
Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. The hearing is titled The Federal Reserve's Semi-Annual Monetary Policy Report. We like creative titles here, and that is our traditional title for Humphrey Hawkins. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous material to the chair for inclusion in the record. I'll note at the outset this hearing has a hard stop at 1 p.m., which we will strictly observe, which seems only humane. I'll now recognize myself for 4 minutes for an opening statement. Thank you, Chair Powell, for being back with us today. With prices increasing more than 20% since President Biden took office, inflation remains top of mind for American families. In fact, only a quarter of Americans describe current economic conditions as good or excellent, according to the most recent data from Gallup's Economic Confidence Index. Despite President Biden's gaslighting, inflation was not 9% when he took office. It was out of control. The out-of-control inflation we're experiencing now is something that this administration did not inherit, but is a product of their policies and their overspending. The nearly $2 trillion partisan and fiscally reckless spending as a part of the American Rescue Plan poured fuel on a smoldering inflationary fire. After a delayed response to runaway inflation, the FOMC has acted with a historic pace of interest rate hikes to ease the pain caused by Democrats' failed economic policies. It is a response, not the actual disease, but the response the Fed is trying to tame these flames, but it's a response to Democrat policies here on Capitol Hill in the administration. So far this year, inflation has been more persistent than many, including the Fed, previously expected. There's still work to be done to reach the Fed's 2% target. As I've repeatedly said, the Fed's, as I repeatedly said, the commitment to independence of the Federal Reserve is of utmost importance, and it is critical, especially in a political year like this. Just as, Chair Powell, just as you did in previous administrations, you must not allow politics to cloud the Fed's monetary policy. However, despite your best efforts, the Fed independence remains at risk. And unfortunately, calls are coming from inside the building. Under Vice Chair Barr, the Fed's regulatory and supervisory agenda has become politicized. Most notably, the development of the Basel III endgame proposal has been a mess. This process has been cloaked in opaque standards and timelines set at meetings of unaccountable global governance bodies. The Fed has promised to process 410 almost universally negative comments, public comments, regarding the unjustified and underutilized initial proposal, or an underanalyzed initial proposal. Recent press reports, which seem to be the only way Congress gets details on the Basel III endgame progress, and your comments yesterday indicate the Fed will finally conduct a long overdue quantitative impact study. That is welcome. And if true, this is a promising development. Chair Powell, the last time you testified before this committee, you stated that the initial Basel III endgame proposal will undergo, quote, broad and material changes, end quote. Yesterday in the Senate, you said the board supports reissuing the updated proposal for public comment. I'm concerned that press reports also claim the Fed will tuck any changes to the proposal into this quantitative impact study. That study, including the substantial changes to the proposal, would then be issued for public feedback with relatively paltry comment period. I'll reiterate to you here what I've said to you in private. Broad and material changes to the Basel III endgame necessitate a full reproposal, full stop. Full stop. Failure to do so will result in an immediate Congressional Review Act vote out of this House of Representatives as quickly as we can possibly process it. Now, it doesn't have to be this way, and I think the Fed adhering to its longstanding principles here is highly important, especially with this interagency process. I'll close with this. Your steady and capable apolitical leadership of the Federal Reserve has shepherded our economy through extreme uncertainty. We now find ourselves in the midst of a new type of uncertainty surrounding the leadership of our nation. Doubts, fears, and panic often lead to bad decision-making and even worse policy. I urge you to reject outside political pressure in this volatile time and stay the course for the good of the American people and our economy as a whole. Thank you for your service, and I yield back. I'll now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back to the Honorable Jerome H. Powell, Chairman, Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Chair Powell, as we saw with the latest jobs report, the labor market remains strong and the economy is surging. Despite inheriting an economy from the prior administration that had the worst jobs record since the Great Depression, President Biden has now overseen a record 15.7 million jobs created since he took office, with 206,000 new jobs created just last month. Not only that, but under the Biden administration, we're witnessing low unemployment rates, rising wages, and stabilizing prices for goods and services. This is not only because of President Biden's strong leadership, but also because of the historic legislation signed into law by President Biden, which has resulted in lower costs, created more jobs, rebuilt our infrastructure, supported small businesses, eliminated mostly junk fees, wiped out more than $144 billion in federal student loan debt for 14 million borrowers, and cut child poverty in half. President Biden is and will continue to advance policies that are providing good-paying jobs and an economy that works for everyone. Now, while I'm pleased to see that inflation is declining, the latest data makes clear that housing remains the #1 driver of core inflation. Since 2020, house prices have increased by nearly 50%, with Americans now spending on average over 30% of their income on housing. This is a top priority for Democrats, but remains an afterthought for Republicans. Earlier this Congress, I reintroduced my comprehensive legislation housing package, including the Housing Crisis Response Act. This bill provides more than $150 billion in fair and affordable housing investments, representing the single largest investment in affordable housing in our nation's history. These funds would create nearly 1.4 million affordable and accessible homes, bring down housing costs for all, and revive the American dream of home ownership. Committee Democrats are committed to getting this bill across the finish line and continue to hold out hope that our Republican colleagues will finally join us in this effort. Unfortunately, extreme MAGA Republicans are not just ignoring housing inflation, they're advancing their Project 2025 manifesto that would dismantle U.S. democracy and the economy as we know it today. Project 2025 is authored by almost 24 former Trump White House staffers and Trump administration officials. It was compiled and published by the ultra-far-right Heritage Foundation, whose CEO recently declared that they are, quote, in the process of a second American revolution, which will be bloodless if the left allows it to be, quote, unquote. And if that kind of talk reminds anyone of the rhetoric we heard in the lead up to and on January 6, 2020, it should. Project 2025 promotes radical ideas to materially undermine the Federal Reserve, if not effectively abolished. MAGA wants to put you out of a job, Chairman Powell, so I look forward to your testimony and hearing from you, a Republican who was first nominated by President Trump, about your thoughts on the importance of the Federal Reserve and the work you have done to help our economy. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I note for the records, Jerome Powell was initially nominated by President Obama to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve before being nominated by President Trump to chair. So here we are. We'll recognize the chair of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee, Mr. Barr, the Andy Barr variety, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Chairman Powell. Runaway inflation and increased interest rates necessary to confront it continue to hammer Americans, and especially those living paycheck to paycheck. Workers and families feel the pain, making everyday purchases at high prices in the grocery aisles and at the pump. They have suffered years of eroding purchasing power in their paychecks under the Biden administration's economic mismanagement. Heightened mortgage rates make it prohibitive for new home buyers to reach the American dream of a starter home for their family. I am pleased that the Fed is resolute in getting inflation under control. I am pleased that you have committed to an apolitical approach to this. I am not pleased by the Fed's opaque, unjustified, politicized, and underanalyzed regulatory proposals, which will ultimately hurt all Americans. We need to know where the Fed is going on its fundamentally flawed Basel III Endgame proposal and its opaque regulatory approach. I yield.
Well, Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Financial Institutions and Monetary Policy Subcommittee, Mr. Foster, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair McHenry and Ranking Member Waters. I'd like to also thank you, Chair Powell, for joining us today and for the role you have played in combating inflation and supporting a stable economic recovery. While the presidency is often the focus of political pronouncements about macroeconomic conditions, there's no question that that undersells the importance and the independence of the work of the Federal Reserve Board. While actions taken by the President and Congress certainly play a significant role, monetary policy decisions made by an independent Federal Reserve are the big dog in shaping macroeconomic conditions that shape economic outcomes for millions of Americans. And work continues on inflation, but significant progress has been made to bring the country in line with the Fed's 2% target. The good news is that macroeconomic policy is working as designed. Well-calibrated monetary policy with fiscal support from the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act has powered strong job creation and low unemployment while staving off a recession that many thought inevitable, and far better, I should point out, than our peer countries. While Democrats are committed to supporting your efforts to cut costs for American families, I yield back.
We'll now welcome the testimony of Jerome Powell, the 16th Chair of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Chair Powell, you'll be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation or testimony. Without objection, your written statement will be made a part of the record. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman McHenry, Ranking Member Waters, and other members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report. The Federal Reserve remains squarely focused on our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the benefit of the American people. Over the past 2 years, the economy has made considerable progress toward the Federal Reserve's 2% inflation goal, and labor market conditions have cooled while remaining strong. Reflecting these developments, the risks to achieving our employment and inflation goals are coming into better balance. I will review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy. Recent indicators suggest that the U.S. economy continues to expand at a solid pace. Gross domestic product growth appears to have moderated in the first half of this year, following impressive strength in the second half of last year. Private domestic demand remains robust, however, with slower but still solid increases in consumer spending. We've also seen moderate growth in capital spending and a pickup in residential investment so far this year. Improving supply conditions have supported resilient demand and the strong performance of the U.S. economy over the past year. In the labor market, a broad set of indicators suggests that conditions have returned to about where they stood on the eve of the pandemic, strong but not overheated. The unemployment rate has moved higher, but was still at a low level of 4.1% in June. Payroll job gains averaged 222,000 jobs per month in the first half of the year. Strong job creation over the past couple of years has been accompanied by an increase in the supply of workers, reflecting increases in labor force participation among individuals aged 25 to 54 and a strong pace of immigration. As a result, the jobs-to-workers gap is well down from its peak and now stands just a bit above its 2019 level. Nominal wage growth has eased over the past year. The strong labor market has helped narrow long-standing disparities in employment and earnings across demographic groups. Inflation has eased notably over the past couple of years, but remains above the committee's longer-run goal of 2%. Total PCE prices rose 2.6% over the 12 months ending in May. Core PCE prices, which exclude the volatile food and energy categories, also increased 2.6%. After a lack of progress toward our 2% inflation objective in the early part of this year, the most recent monthly readings have shown modest further progress. Longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. Our monetary policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. In support of these goals, the committee has maintained the target range for the federal funds rate at 5.25% to 5.5% since last July, after having tightened the stance of monetary policy significantly over the previous year and a half. We've also continued to reduce our securities holdings. At our May meeting, we decided to slow the pace of balance sheet runoff starting in June, consistent with the plans released previously. Our restrictive monetary policy stance is helping to bring demand and supply into better balance and to put downward pressure on inflation. The committee has stated that we do not expect it will be appropriate to reduce the target range for the federal funds rate until we have gained greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably toward 2%. Incoming data for the first quarter of this year did not support such greater confidence. The most recent inflation readings, however, have shown some modest further progress, and more good data would strengthen our confidence that inflation is moving sustainably toward 2%. We continue to make decisions meeting by meeting. We know that reducing policy restraint too soon or too much could stall or even reverse the progress that we've seen on inflation. At the same time, in light of the progress made both in lowering inflation and in cooling the labor market over the past 2 years, elevated inflation is not the only risk we face. Reducing policy restraint too late or too little could unduly weaken economic activity and employment. In considering adjustments to the target range for the federal funds rate, the committee will continue its practice of carefully assessing incoming data and their implications for the evolving outlook, the balance of risks, and the appropriate path of monetary policy. Congress has entrusted the Fed with the operational independence that is needed to take a longer-term perspective in the pursuit of our dual mandate of maximum employment and price stability. We remain committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Restoring price stability is essential to achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the long run. Our success in delivering on those goals matters to all Americans. I'll conclude by emphasizing that we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Chair Powell. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Chair Powell, let's begin with this question of the Basel III endgame. I know you had questions about it yesterday, but I think we need further clarity. Your testimony about Vice Chair Barr's discussions with the FDIC and with the OCC on the next steps for the Basel III endgame. You mentioned potential changes have been made to the original Basel III endgame, that a lot of progress has been made, and that the board is very close to agreeing on the substance of those changes. But the next steps, that's really what I want to get into. Let's get through the mechanics of what happens next. If the Fed, the OCC, and the FDIC agree on the substance of whatever changes you're going to make, what happens then? Like, walk through the mechanics as you anticipated.
Okay. So we're very close to having exactly that agreement on the substance of the proposed changes pursuant to those talks. The next question then is how to proceed. And, it is my view and the strong view of a number of board members that the appropriate thing to do is to take that new proposal and publish it along with the effects of the quantitative impact survey and put that out for comment again and receive comment on that and then take some time to review those comments before finalizing the regulation. And that's a discussion we're having with the other two agencies now. We have not been able to reach agreement on a path to do that, but that's something that we think is the right way to do. That's what we've done in similar situations. There aren't that many similar situations, but when we see broad and material changes to an important regulation, we think let's go out again and give all the commenters another chance to comment.
Yeah, and that also avoids serious lawsuit risk and the risk that Congress step in and overturn this rulemaking using the Congressional Review Act. I think the other agencies here, if they're not agreeing with the Fed, they're running against the independence of the Federal Reserve here. This is not a trifling matter of policy. This is a matter of real substance for the independence of the Fed and rulemaking at the Federal Reserve, which I think we should be able to keep the independence of the Fed separate, especially in this political environment. But opening up to a new comment period, so that means you have to get consensus for the Board of Governors on the policy. You have to get the agreement of the scandal-plagued chair of the FDIC or the 5-member board of the FDIC. You have to get agreement by the acting comptroller of the currency. These people should not have real standing with the Fed on a matter of serious policy, especially with a chair of the FDIC that is being ousted by his own party as soon as they can get a replacement confirmed. It's an absurd thing that the Fed has to go to an acting comptroller of the currency and a guy who's going to be out of a job very soon at the FDIC and get agreement. But thank you for listening. That was more of to convey this. So the quantitative impact analysis, is this going to include the interplay with the stress tests, GSIB surcharge, all the other capital charges here? Will that be a part of the quantitative impact analysis?
It'll be this proposal, which does include changes to the GSIB surcharge, but does not include the stress tests.
Okay. But the goal here with the quantitative impact is to actually measure the impact of these rules as enacted, right? Based upon what is existing regulatory structures. Okay.
That's right.
All right, so let's get into the question of balance sheet as quickly as we can. 2.5 years ago, you stated, quote, the committee intends to slow and then stop the decline in the size of the balance sheet when reserve balances are somewhat above the level it judges to be consistent with ample reserves. That's 2.5 years ago. Where are we in this question of what are ample reserves?
Well, so the balance sheet, the runoff in the portfolio is now, I think, $1.7 trillion so far. So we've made quite a lot of progress. We think we have a good ways to go, and as I mentioned and as you just mentioned, we've now slowed the pace really with a view to getting as far as we can without creating frictions and disruption that might cause us to prematurely stop shrinking. Going a little bit slower might actually enable us to go further. We think we have quite a ways to go. It's very hard to be precise about it. It's really a question of supply and demand, and we'll find that level with a little bit of a buffer on top of it, and that's where we'll stop.
All right, thank you for your testimony. The ranking member, Ms. Waters, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairman Powell, are you familiar with Project 2025?
Not really, no.
You've heard about it?
I really don't focus on these things at all.
You don't focus, but you know there's something known as a Project 2025? The reason I'm asking you is because one proposal is to get rid of the Fed's dual mandate to promote only stable prices, but also maximum employment. This is your mandate. These are mandates, right? This is what you do. Is that right?
We do serve a dual mandate, that's right.
And so if there was anything that would get rid of the mandate, what would it do to our economy? What would it do to our country?
So the question of which mandate we serve is very much a question for Congress. My own view has been that the dual mandate has served us well. This is something Congress can change and change back to a single mandate.
What do you do to get maximum employment? What do you do?
We have one tool on the economy, and that is we raise and lower interest rates. You'll find, though, that anyway, we certainly at the Fed do believe that the dual mandate has a good thing, and it's enabled us to. It has not stopped us from controlling inflation when that was the thing that needed to be done.
And so, while of course I understand you may not have seen, heard, or read Project 2025, are you familiar with an effort in the country to get rid of diversity and inclusion?
I see these things mentioned, but honestly, we're pretty focused on our task, which is maximum employment, price stability. We're strong supporters of diversity at the Fed, as you know.
Are you aware that I created a subcommittee on diversity and employment in this committee?
Yes, I remember that.
And do you think that getting rid of diversity and inclusion interferes with your ability to really realize the mandate of maximum employment?
I spent most of my career in the private sector, and what I observed was really successful institutions in the United States, companies, organizations generally, are those that do a job on diversity and get the best out of people and attract a broad, diverse range of talents to the table, and people feel comfortable speaking. So that's the way we feel about it at the Fed, and that's what we've been doing and will continue to do.
And do you think it's important not only to have diversity and inclusion in the public sector, but in the private sector?
Yes, and as I mentioned, if you look at very successful American companies, you will very often see that they're good at that. They're good at hiring, attracting, investing in, and keeping diverse talent. That's one of the things that our really good U.S. public companies do well.
Have you seen improvement during your tenure where diversity and inclusion has created opportunities for more jobs and helped to reduce the unemployment rate?
Certainly seen, I think you see over the course of my long career a big change in diversity and inclusion. And you see that in the private sector and the public sector, and I think that's generally progress. I do.
Under the work of this committee, and the subcommittee is chaired by Ms. Beatty, she was able to gather important data about what was going on in the private sector. And what she discovered was that many of the CEOs and others welcomed the opportunity to learn more and to do better and to get assistance. And we saw improvement with diversity and inclusion. Have you seen that?
There's no question. If you talk to CEOs, they get this. If you want to attract the best talent in our country now, you need to be committed to these things.
And so I would like to compliment you on the job that you have been doing. I'd like to compliment you on keeping us informed about inflation. Not only do I welcome you here today, I look forward to working with you for years to come. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Arkansas, the Vice Chair of the full committee, Mr. Hill, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the Chair. Chair Powell, thanks so much and welcome back to the committee. I want to pick up where Senator Tim Scott and Chair McHenry left off and reiterate my strong support for your comment yesterday in the Senate about the need to repropose the Basel III endgame. The Supreme Court's precedent, I think, makes clear that if a rule undergoes broad and material changes from the proposal to final rule, the public must be given a meaningful opportunity to review, comment on those changes. You generally share that view, I think. Is that right?
Yes.
And I'm looking forward to seeing the results of the quantitative impact study and the separate comment period, as well as an interagency agreement you referenced yesterday. Because of Dodd-Frank's role and the Vice Chair for Supervision, Vice Chairman Barr's role and the Fed's role, would it be fair to say the Fed is a first among equals on proposing a rule like this? In other words, does the Fed have a supremacy position on determining whether it should be fully reproposed or not, or do you view it strictly as a collaborative basis? Just curious in your view on that.
I would say it's strictly collaborative, and I would say that our discussions with the FD, which Vice Chair Barr has actually been conducting, and the OCC, they've been very productive so far. So I want to make sure to say that we've continued to work our way through this, and I believe we will get fairly soon to a resolution of the remaining process issue.
Good. Well, let me turn from that subject to the Court's recent decision to overturn the so-called Chevron doctrine. Many of us believe this was the first step to reining in decades, literally, of an unprecedented, uncontrolled growth in the administrative state. And so I think all of us on at least this side of the aisle are certainly saying to the Federal Reserve and other federal agencies in our jurisdiction that we want to reassert Article I authority over the direction that independent agencies work. Would it be fair to ask you to certify that because of this change in Chevron that the Fed would commit to promulgating new rules only if they're at the direction of an explicit congressional authorization?
So I think, first of all, we're studying that and several other decisions that have just come down in the last week or two, so I haven't got anything definitive for you on that. I think you know us to be an organization, I know us to be an organization that is strongly committed to the rule of law. Supreme Court says what the law is. We'll always do what we believe the law is.
Well, I'll submit that question maybe in more detail in writing, and maybe you'll have a chance to reflect on that. Back in February, you were on 60 Minutes, and you said the U.S. budget deficit, the national debt are unsustainable. Do you still view that the U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path?
I do. I think I tried to be clear that the level of the U.S. debt is not itself unsustainable, but the path that we're on is unsustainable, and I think that is not controversial.
I think many of us certainly agree with that, and we know that when the deficit's at 3 times the economic growth rate and growing, it's of concern, and it's contributed to inflation. Just 3 years ago in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, you gave a speech where you were confident that inflation was transitory, which I think we've come to realize it's not the case. This hearing is sort of a can't-miss opportunity for the Fed to demonstrate some humility on the monetary policy decisions, which some on this side of the aisle particularly think have made inflation worse. Your August 2020 Jackson Hole speech, you said the flexible average inflation targeting framework regarding 2%, that you would let it run above 2%. Was the Fed blinded by the previous 20 years of global change that was deflationary and or you were not alert enough in 2020 to be more cautious about that change in policy?
So we were certainly mindful of a long period of time in which there have been very low interest rates, but also very low inflation, suggesting that the neutral interest rate must have fallen quite substantially. That was the standard view. The thing we didn't see coming was the pandemic. It's not like everything went off the rails. It's like we had this pandemic, and it really changed the way the economy is working. We had a big crisis. We did a lot of things. So the concerns that led us to, those concerns that we were in a world of very low interest rates all the time.
But now wouldn't you say we're in a very opposite situation where because of reshoring and tariffs and other policies that are quite inflationary?
I would say this. Those concerns are, right now we have the policy rate in the mid-5s, right? And we see the policy is restrictive, but really interest rates, the neutral interest rate must have moved up, at least in the short term. So I think that's the question we'll be asking ourselves in our review, which begins at the end of this year.
We look forward to that.
How much of what we did in that time period is relevant to the new world where rates appear to be higher?
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and welcome, Chair Powell. It's great seeing you. Last time I saw you, we had the gracious pleasure of you visiting with me in my office, and we discussed a great variety of things. Thank you for that visit. Now, Chair Powell, this year the Fed tested 31 banks, up from 23 last year. Is that correct?
I believe that's right, yes.
And by estimating losses, revenues, expenses, and capital level under hypothetical stress scenarios. We did that, correct?
Yes.
And all 31 banks remained above their minimum common equity tier 1 capital requirements after observing losses of nearly $685 billion. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, I wanted to get those figures out and provide you with, you may have heard this, but I want to share it with the nation because your Vice Chair Barr made this statement, and I wanted to put this in the record, his exact quote from this great achievement. He said, "Our goal of our stress test is to help ensure that we have enough capital to absorb losses in a highly stressful scenario. And this test shows that we do." I thought that was a great statement of your record. Now, let me ask you my question. It's simple. Will the 2024 Fed stress test results have an impact on how prudential regulators roll out a new and updated capital proposal?
So the two are really two different things. there's the Basel III capital proposal, and then there's the stress tests. So, and really the Basel III, as I mentioned, we've discussed, we're almost ready to put forward for further comment a revised proposal with material and broad changes to it. The stress tests are a different thing, and of course we realize we have to adapt those over time and be open to changes, and it has evolved significantly over time, but it's really a separate thing from the Basel III endgame.
Give us a little bit more information on the Basel III, because I worked with you with this. Our work goes all the way back to the Obama administration when we responded to that crisis with our banks. And you and I worked that up, where we came up with the hardest hit program to help those who were suffering with, those states that were suffering with high unemployment and at the same time high home foreclosures. And we were successful. And we've established that program, and it's still going on and helping many of our states. But I want to also share what is happening around the world as a result of our activities. The European Union is now set to delay key parts of its bank capital rules by more than a year, so that their lenders will not be at a disadvantage. Over in Canada, it's important to know that their banking regulators have also delayed for another year, imposing high capital rules on countries' banks at the risk of making them uncompetitive. And the Swiss National Bank is highly unlikely now to adopt a proposed 15% capital requirement for UPS and other Swiss banks. And the Bank of England has issued a near-final proposal to increase UK bank capital by 3%. And I think this is all a measure of your great work and that of your vice chair. And I just wanted to let you have a comment on that, please.
Sure. So we're committed to finalizing this proposal. Our banks are going to live with these rules for a long, long time. The main thing is to get it right, and that's what we're doing. What we do in the end will be consistent with the Basel agreement, and it will also be consistent with what other comparable large jurisdictions are doing.
You're doing a great job. Keep up the good work.
We'll recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Chairman Powell, and also thank you for continue to indicate that you will look at the entirety of the economy, the whole economy. I appreciate that. So one of the nation's largest banks recently warned in a memo, and it's also been voiced by smaller banks, that the current pace of regulations such as changes to capital requirements and lowering debit card interchange caps could lead to new fees associated with checking accounts and other increased costs for small businesses. This does come amid expiring tax provisions that are sunsetting as we speak, that are critical for small business, such as the R&D tax credit, interest deductibility, and bonus depreciation. This does raise the question, are you considering how these regulations and tax increases will directly work against your mandate to achieve 2% inflation? Moreover, with the proposed changes to Basel III, it is crucial to ensure that all stakeholders have a voice in this process, which you are stating will occur. And a Basel re-proposal and adequate comment period are certainly very welcome. So, Chairman Powell, yesterday in the Senate, you mentioned that the majority view of the board is to re-propose Basel III for comment period. Could you clarify if this means the proposal will be re-proposed from scratch, and any other specifics you can provide?
Sure. So we haven't reached agreement on this. As I mentioned, we're working through this with our colleagues at the FDIC and the OCC. And I can't tell you exactly what the form of it would be. The sense of it would be, though, that we're making material changes and that we would want the public to have a chance to look at those changes in the light of the way they play off against the quantitative impact survey, and should have a reasonable time to comment on those. In addition, we're focused on one big area, but there are institutions that have made comments all across the spectrum, and we're reading all of those carefully. And we're not going to republish all of those. Some of those we can just make changes and move forward on. So it's going to be a very labor-intensive, time-consuming process.
Okay.
Writing these things up takes a long time, and we're going to get it right.
Good, that's great. Obviously, Canada recently postponed, as did the EU and UK, for international competition standpoint. It seems to make sense, and so that's appreciated. Chairman, would you agree that excessive spending, increased taxes, limits on domestic energy production, in principle, are a cause for higher costs for business, contributes to inflation, and as well tightens the labor markets, kind of running contrary to your two mandates?
You're asking me a kind of a political question there. I don't want to criticize a platform of economic fiscal policies that are not really ours to decide.
It's more of an economic question, but I appreciate your answer, sir. So when you mentioned recalibrate policy yesterday in the Senate hearing, was part of your thinking taking a more holistic view of economic conditions?
Yes, very much so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Chairman, is there any data to support the so-called greedflation? This term greedflation somehow has caused inflation. Is there any data to support those comments?
So we look at it that this inflation has been caused by a combination of, very strong demand and constrained supply. So it was really a high-speed collision between an economy that was reopening. And by the way, there was inflation all over the world at the same time, so these are some common factors. But at the same time, you had tremendous demand, for example, for automobiles. You had constrained supply because there weren't enough semiconductors, long story short. But, so that to us is what this inflation is all about. So we've observed, the sort of healing of the supply side at the same time restrictive monetary policies weighing on demand, and we've seen inflation coming down from those.
So there's no data that supports that gouging of consumers is part of the inflation.
It's been very hard to track a connection with, earnings and things.
Secretary Yellen mentioned that she didn't feel that there was grocery price shock and that sort of thing. Groceries and gasoline are the two driving problems for American families and certainly my constituents. Do you believe your policies are helping to alleviate in those two areas?
So a lot of things affect, let's take energy first. The energy prices are generally set at the global level. We do have some effect on that.
Sorry, Chairman, I've run out of time. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, we can continue.
Great, thanks.
The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being here. In some ways, I want to follow up or at least respond to the very civil, but I think reason of why we need an independent central bank. And your response was, the question you raised would, if I answered it, it would be along some kind of a political avenue, and you didn't want to drive on that avenue. So I'm also very much concerned about a lot of the discussion. I've been on this committee a while, and so it comes up quite often. When the Federal Reserve was birthed around the turn of the century, I think, around 1913, 1918, somewhere like that, prior to the establishment of the central bank, was our country experiencing a lot of recessions because of no security? People felt no security, particularly the business community, in making big investments because nobody was in control. Just kind of think what went on just went on. Is that relevant?
Yes, I think the lack of a central bank between 1836 and the founding of the Fed was a period of lots and lots of depressions, and a lot of it had to do with the crop cycle and the banks not being able to handle the very large seasonal swings, and there was no central bank to provide liquidity. So that's really what gave rise to the founding of the Fed in the early part of the last century.
Do you think that it would be that it is dangerous to blend monetary policy and fiscal policy?
To blend them?
Yes.
So we try to keep them very separate, and we try not to express views on fiscal policy that's for elected people who have undergone elections and won and make those very difficult decisions. We have a really specific, narrow but important mandate that you've given us, and we try to stick to that. And so we take your policies as given, and then we conduct monetary policy with that.
I don't want to draw you into any kind of a political response, but and I have not read all of this Project 2025 document. I read some of it online a couple of nights ago, but even whether it comes out of a 2025 or a 3089, whatever, one of the things that I'm concerned about, reading this from this document, that the document argues that the Federal Reserve is the inflation problem, and eliminating the Federal Reserve, imposing economic policy on the Fed that does not come from within the Fed. So I